Welcome to Great Minds with Lost&Found, the podcast that connects people and reimagines systems to improve mental health for youth and young adults. I'm your host, Joel Kaskinen. Lost&Found is a comprehensive nonprofit organization that aims to do more to eliminate suicide for youth and young adults in the United States. Now that you know who we are and what we're all about, let's get to the show. Hello, and welcome to Great Minds with Lost&Found, the podcast where we connect humans and reimagine systems to improve mental health for all in South Dakota and the surrounding areas. I'm your host, Joel Kaskinen, and here with me today is my coworker, my desk buddy, our postvention specialist, and all things wellness, Dakotah Jordan. Would you mind introducing us for our listeners? Introducing you to our listeners?
Yes. This will be great. Like Joel said, my name is Dakotah. I have been in Sioux Falls since 2016 and consider it home. I don't like to tell people where I'm from. Just kidding. It's Iowa. I hate that. And I've worked in nonprofit work, for-profit work. I've been an owner. I've been an employee. I've had every side job under the sun. I love learning. So that's part of that experience. I have my bachelor's degree in social work, and I'm also a community health worker at Lost&Found. And yeah, that's like work, boring stuff, I guess. And I love hiking. I love kayaking. I love being outside. I'd prefer to be barefoot, and I consider chicken tenders as their own food group.
That was perhaps the best introduction that we have had had on
I want to be the most exciting person you've had on the podcast.
I mean, honestly, and here I am tapping the table. Sorry, listeners. Well, that was a fabulous introduction.
Thank you.
I would love to just hear a little bit more about who you are in terms of your work with Lost&Found. So can you tell us what your role as the Survivors Joining for Hope coordinator is?
Yes. So in August, I was brought in to run this new program that was kind of new and kind of not. It was new to us. And Survivors Joining for Hope was actually a program that had existed for a while that was started by a man named Brad Hurst. And it was coming under the umbrella of Lost&Found. And it was going to give us the opportunity to start doing what we would refer to as postvention, which we can talk about later. But this program, in its simplest form, is a direct service program. We offer financial assistance and resource support to anyone who has lost a loved one or a family member to suicide. And we just come alongside those people. And my role as the coordinator of that is to make all those phone calls, to go through applications, and to walk alongside these people in their grief.
That is heavy stuff. And
yes, it is.
Also so important. And we could not do this work without having brought you on in August, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, we're very grateful to have you on our team. And we need someone with your drive and your stability to make this program successful. And so just in the couple of months that you've been doing stuff with this program, I've seen the amount of success that you have had and that we have had, but also on the flip side of that, the amount of need that there is.
Mm-hmm.
Can you talk about the landscape of loss and grief in South Dakota? I didn't prepare you for this question, but I just was thinking about, like, overall, what does that look like?
Yeah. So, I don't necessarily have statistics to share of what that looks like. That's something you talk about on here often, of what the landscape of suicide loss is. But ultimately, when we're talking about the loss piece, right, this is something that is unexpected for most, if not all. Mm-hmm. This is often a case where life insurance doesn't come into play, where people haven't left behind funding for this. And so families are left scrambling once with their traumatic loss that they've just endured, but then also we get slapped with a financial burden. Funerals are very expensive, and they're running a business, and it's all of these things that they're going through, right? Anytime with any sort of loss, whether you knew that it was coming, you didn't know that it was coming, you prepared for it, you haven't, there is grief. There is going to be grief, and there's going to be that emotion to process. But I think specifically for our families of suicide loss, that financial burden on top of that grief, along with the I'm not going to be able to say this word right now, stigmatization of those families is they're extremely isolated.
Yeah.
And often when we're talking about the landscape of South Dakota, right, we have our metropolis of Sioux Falls, and then we have West River, where there's some resources, but we have all of these tiny towns spread in between. And maybe there's another suicide loss survivor in your community. Maybe there's not, but there might not be as much access to resources. And so it can be incredibly more isolating, right, when you don't have a community to wrap around you. And so when we're thinking about why it's really important for us to provide this service, it's because they might not have anybody else. And again, this is something we can kind of talk about later, but this is when postvention becomes prevention, right? We want all of those people to know that they're not alone, and that they are not the only people that are experiencing this type of pain, this type of loss, this type of isolation, and this type of pressure and burden with their finances as well.
So hearing that it can be so isolating and that there's not a lot of resources in this grief and loss space, what makes Survivors Joining for Hope so unique?
Yes. So I actually had someone reach out to me a few days ago from Arizona because their program, they do some postvention services. And she was trying to find a program out there that offered financial assistance. And she's searching through the entire country. And the only place that she found was us.
Wow.
So people don't do financial assistance. I think the thing that makes our program so special, of course, there are other programs that do a really great job throughout South Dakota, throughout the country, that offer support to suicide loss survivors. But that financial support piece is not happening anywhere else. When it comes to financial assistance that you could get for something like a funeral or a burial expense, there is some things through the county that you can qualify for, but ultimately that's a lien, something that you have to pay back. And there's a lot of paperwork with it. And in the instance of, say, that I'm dealing with a family who has lost their father and they don't know where any of his documents are, right? They don't know how to get access to his tax documents and where his financial stuff. They don't even know where his bank account is. So how are you supposed to fill out an application with all of this financial information when you don't even know where to look? So through that, this financial piece and the spirit of our program being that we want to help lift that financial burden and not make someone jump through 1,001 hoops to get to the other side of that is a really important piece. And I think it's really crucial. And I'm really excited that our friends down in Arizona are trying to start this. And hopefully this will be a type of support that becomes a little bit more readily available for families like this.
That's cool. First off, that we are so unique that we are being reached out to from people across the country. That's awesome. Secondly, where does our money come from? You know, we offer this financial assistance package to survivors of suicide loss. Where do we get that money? Where does that come from, and where does it go? What is it exactly used for?
Yeah, isn't that always the lovely question inside of nonprofits? Where is the money?
We have to talk about it.
Yeah, so where that money originally came from, when we were handed the Survivors Joining for Hope organization and turned it into a program that was of Lost and Found, there was a pool of money that was available that we were given that was specifically going to be used for offering that money to families. At this point, we are trying to figure out how we replenish that fund, how we make that that it has longevity, that it has sustainability, that every single year we can kind of see what our numbers were and some of our averages. And so we can figure out what that number is that we need to have. And hopefully we'll have this in an endowment fund so that we can have those monies available to us every year. But when you're asking the question of where is this money going to, I think that's important as well. A lot of the people that we have seen in our program so far, we've helped 13 families with some sort of financial assistance. Most, not all, but most of that has went towards funeral, burial, cremation type expenses. That's typically the biggest thing for people right away. And that is where our expenses are going. We also will give expenses or will give financial assistance to other expenses if people need legal fees for any reason that they need attorneys to get access to bank accounts or money or things like that. If it's biohazard cleanup, if it's if they want to go to therapy and they can't afford it, or if they don't have insurance, there's a multitude of things that we would help with. Really, if it has anything to do with we lost someone from suicide and now we're going through a hardship financially, then that is something that we would help with. I know that previously, when Brad was running the program before it was given to Lost and Found, there was a family that their fridge went out in their house and they didn't have another option to buy one, right? After paying for things like the funeral expenses and all of that. And so that might seem like a really silly thing to most of us of, oh, you used this money to buy a fridge, but where does all of the food in your house go, right? It goes in your fridge. So it was a necessary expense to help that family. And ultimately that was tied to their loss. So it can be for a variety of things.
Yeah. Is there a cap or a limit on where this money is going and how much money we can provide to families? Just for listeners who might have not know anything about this program, I want to give them all of the information. So what's the cap? What is the limitations? Is there anything that we can't use that money for?
Yeah. So it hasn't necessarily come up that there's anything that we can't use that money for. Specifically, I guess our guidelines are that we serve families that have a connection to South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa, whether they are residents here or the person that they lost was a resident here. Of course, we have had college students that we have lost and their family was not from here, but they were going to school here. And ultimately, that family has to deal with more expenses, right? Because they're flying from halfway across the country to handle everything here and then trying to get their loved one back home. And so really, if they have that connection to South Dakota, Minnesota, and Iowa, we're going to help them. The cap of assistance is $2,500 per family. What we know and why we chose that number is because that will cover most, if not all, of the expenses for a basic cremation.
Oh, I didn't realize that was why that number had been chosen.
Yeah, so
that makes sense.
It helps with that. But ultimately, and something else that I guess maybe could be controversial with our program, it is not. We are a financial program, but I don't see it as my responsibility to tell anyone how to lay their loved one to rest. Funerals are expensive. All of the things that you need if you're going to do a burial versus a cremation, if you're going to have a service, if you're not, if you're going to do food. Some people want people to gather. Some people don't want people to gather. And none of those decisions are mine. And frankly, I don't believe that they are our financial assistance programs' decisions to make either. If they want us to help consult them on those issues to ultimately make that a more affordable choice for them, then great. But this is a once in a lifetime chance. And I just don't feel like it's my place. But with that, we've seen invoices that are $15,000 to lay their loved one to rest. And then $2,500 is still the only cap of assistance that we're going to get. And that might seem like a drop in the bucket. But we do help them with, do you need help setting up a GoFundMe page or do you have resources for that? Is what other, are you able to work something out with the funeral home? Is anyone offering some sort of discount? Is there other family members that you can reach out to? And kind of giving them some of that support on other avenues that they can get outside of our assistance. But for some of those families where they know that there's going to be absolutely no other support for them and they're going with kind of that basic way to lay their loved one to rest, it will cover most, if not all of that.
That's cool. I didn't realize that was why that financial denotation, amount was specified.
And part of that is also because of funding too, right? We don't have an unlimited pool of money.
Of course.
We would love, ultimately I'm the one that sees those invoices and I talk to the family. I would love to write the check for however much the amount is. Yeah. But we have to have more than enough to go around. Yeah. So. Mm-hmm.
Cool. Well, thanks for sharing a little bit of the basics of the, kind of behind the scenes of the program, what it is, what provisions we offer, and what support structures there are. I want to kind of bring it back to the bigger picture when we're talking about the current situation of suicide loss and especially grief in not just South Dakota, not just Sioux Falls, but overall in the United States. We, as our organization, Lost and Found, follow the CDC's guidelines for a lot of the work that we do. And we've chosen to do that because we know that it's data driven. The statistics show that this stuff is working. These strategies are preventative. And so we have adopted those. So there's 7 strategies outlined by the CDC that we use. I think a couple of the strategies that we utilize very heavily in this program, and correct me if I'm wrong, and you can, kind of jump in here, are creating healthy connections through programs like Survivors Training for Hope.
Yep.
Can you talk to me a little bit about the relationship building aspect that is so critical, especially in the grief space, and what that has been like for you in just the last 7-8 months that you've been with us?
Yeah. So this is kind of ever growing and evolving as we build this program, because we want to be so much more than just the program that writes the checks and then never talks to you again, right? So a big part of what brings people in is that financial assistance, where they go through the application and then I call them, and then they're kind of going through that process of approval, and then I call them again and let them know. And that's just the beginning of that relationship. And I think there definitely is some trust that is built there. For some of the benefit, you can see I'm a complete stranger to them at that point, and that they can tell whatever too, right? I typically, without even asking, get the entire story of what happened to their loved one and everything else that's surrounding them and all these things that they're dealing with. And it's just kind of someone for them to unload on while they are going through this really difficult process. For most of our families, when they call us, it's really close to around the funeral. We either catch them as they're planning the funeral or right afterwards. We have had a few that reach out to us, months later as we've gotten more word out about our program, but most of the time we're catching people right in that space. So this is a very foggy, cloudy, emotional time, and I'm just some random lady calling them on the phone, offering them potentially money to help them with all these things that they're dealing with. And so I'm definitely trying to be a listening ear for them at that time and allow them that space for whatever they need, also while giving them, the facts of the program and what we can do and what we can provide. But I want to be the person there that is taking the stress off. There was, when I was talking to this family and they were saying, well, she asked me a question and I was like, oh, I don't really quite know the answer to that, but I'm more than willing to find out for you. I'll Google it. And she's like, oh, well, I can Google it too. And I'm like, you need to be working on funeral arrangements. I can't do that for you. But what I can do is look up all of this information. And ultimately, it's going to make me better at my job. Hopefully, you don't ever have to deal with this information ever again. And so it's those pieces, which I'm hoping every piece of that empathetic experience is helping people kind of build trust and know that they do have someone to call and they do have someone to rely on and that they aren't so alone. And also, as we're talking about this program, that they're thinking, oh, well, maybe there is other people like me too, right? So that's the beginning piece of it. But through that, I hope to not go away, right? So I do a 3-week follow-up call with them in this process, kind of depending on where they're at. If they're ready for referrals, we want to get them connected to support groups. We want to get them connected to therapists if they would like to, and any other supportive resources. I send out a sheet with kind of a grief resources place to start, which will send them to a bunch of different places on the internet where they can get daily emails about grief and they can read things that are specific about suicide loss survivors. And so it's kind of all of these bunny trails is kind of what I hope to give people of all of these places where they can connect in community. And not all of those places are going to connect with everyone, but maybe they would find some other people like them. And at the end of all of those resources that they may or may not choose to get connected to, they know that I'm still going to be calling them for a whole nother year.
Yeah. Wow. So talk about the wraparound of support there. I mean, that's prevention in and of itself, which I guess is a good segue to the next part of our conversation that I want to have. We've talked about Survivors Joining for Hope being the financial assistance program that we provide as a direct service. But for those that don't know, our listeners, the lay person, what is postvention and what does that space look like and how does survivors fit into that?
Yeah. So most people haven't heard that word. I've said that word out loud to a lot of people, and they give me this glazed over look like, I don't know what the heck you're talking about. And postvention is really any type of support that happens after a suicide occurs. So it is stabilizing the situation, it's reducing risk, it is helping people on their emotional journeys, is kind of the simple thing, but it's really any of the support, any of the services that is offered after a suicide occurs.
And where does Survivors Joining for Hope fit into that?
Yeah. So, I mean, definitely with it being a direct support program, right? A suicide occurs and we are hopefully jumping in. I think another thing that is going to be another stage in our program is helping people realize that even if they don't need us for financial assistance, that resource support is there. And that's something that I would really like people to know is, yeah, maybe you do have money set aside or you don't feel like that's something that you need help with, but I would still love to get people in our system of, can we get you connected to things? And because ultimately I want to connect more and more of those people, right? If there's a walk happening in your area and all of these things that I can kind of network, that seems like a weird word to use, but kind of network suicide loss survivors together. There's lots of places.
You're just trying to promote healthy connection.
Yes, and do all of that. And I think we have people in this community, Wendy Mamer at the Helpline Center and Bridget out in Front Porch in Rapid City and Angela Drake. Like all of these people are people in our community who've been doing this work for a while. And they are all suicide loss survivors themselves. I am not, which makes me a very interesting kind of mix in this, but they are all kind of doing that networking piece all the time. And that's where I hope to be in that. So going back to your question of, what is postvention and kind of how does our program fit into that? This direct services program is a big piece of that, but we also are trying to do more, right? So whenever someone is lost, obviously there is family and there are loved ones that are going to have to handle things like the funerals. And again, that's where Survivors Joining for Hope comes in. But that person potentially had a workplace, or they were going to school, or they belonged to some sort of organization. This isn't an isolated incident. So that family isn't necessarily the only place that needs care after a suicide occurs. A workplace might also need care. The school that they went to might also need care. The organizations that they volunteered in, their community as a whole is also going to be grieving, is going to need resources, is going to need support. And so as we think about what else postvention is at Lost and Found, we are starting to think beyond just our services to the family and what are our services to schools, because Lost and Found does a lot of work with campus. So that's kind of our first thought is how do we support schools in after this happens? We had 3 suicides occur at a West River school this year, and we were very active with them and helping them create policy and procedures and how they respond to that, how they provide support to their staff and their administration that are ultimately having to support the students that need care. And we were kind of in all of that mix. So we don't exactly know what all of those supports and services look like yet. We're still kind of in the creation phase, but that's where we're moving is how can we support these other organizations? What do they need from us? Because we know that it's going to look different than our direct support program to families, but that they need it too.
Yeah, definitely. Sounds like we've got a lot of road ahead of us, but
Yes.
that's also exciting. That means that we're not done yet and that there's lots more rallying of troops, a lot more of, reaching out for financial assistance so that way we can continue providing those resources and support. But it also means that we have room to grow in prevention, which ultimately we keep saying that postvention is prevention.
Correct.
So I want to talk about that a little bit using the CDC's 7 strategies. So when we think about postvention and specifically the work that Lost and Found is doing, we're utilizing a couple of the resources, a couple of the strategies. Identify and support people at risk and lessen harms to and preventing future risk, I think, are 2 things that we are doing through the postvention services that we are going to be launching in the future. But also we're putting that stepping stone in place with Survivors Joining for Hope. Talk us through a little bit of that.
Yeah. So what we know is that when people are exposed to suicide, their own risk of suicide then goes up, right? We also have talked a little bit about how grief can be a very isolating experience because it's different when, in a situation like that where suicide occurs and maybe it was in a group of friends, maybe that group of friends understands each other a little bit more. But if there's someone really far removed from it, right? I'm really sad and I'm grieving and the rest of the world doesn't know that internal experience. And eventually they want things to go back to normal because normal feels a lot more comfortable, right? I don't know how to handle the fact that you cry at any random time, and I don't know how to talk to you about it, right? A lot of times we just don't know how to have those conversations. We don't know how to be with people in grief. We haven't been taught that, and we just want things to be happy, right? Everybody's dealing with crap in their lives, whether it's grief or something else, and a lot of times we're just searching for happiness. So I think some of that like uncomfortability, right, kind of gets in the way. But there's more risk there, right? So when we can't have conversations with each other, when we're going through hard things, and when we can't come together, then I think that's a risk factor as well, right? That can bring more isolation. And so with all of our post-vention services, we want to educate people. We want to talk about the grief process. We want to talk about noticing those signs and symptoms. If people are at school or at work and they're drawing away, maybe they were really close to this person, they're starting to feel really isolated. Maybe they're having thoughts of wanting to join that person if it was their loved one. And so there's lots of things that can be surrounding this. And if we can come in and provide services and help kind of bridge some of that and help people feel like they're not alone or that they're understood, then that's where post-vention closes the gap, right? Of now it is prevention because we have lost someone and we want to make sure that that doesn't happen again. But in order to do that, we have to provide resources to people who are left behind because ultimately they're higher at risk.
Yeah. Wow. It's a nonstop, never-ending journey, isn't it?
Yeah.
No, I mean, obviously you and I have these conversations a lot. The rest of Lost and Found has these conversations a lot, but it's not as, common for just anyone to talk about grief and to talk about what they're feeling after a loss. And that could be a suicide loss or it could be a loss of any other kind. But I do think that grief is something that we as a mental health care organization need to continue training people on and talking about and normalizing because it is so real and everyone grieves every day something. Someone today is grieving. There's thousands of people today that are grieving. I'm still in my grief space and grief arena, as I call it, like getting boxed around every once in a while. I have good days, I have bad days. You do too. But I think that we need to normalize that and, teach coping skills and teach strategies for understanding and processing and navigating grief because that is also part of prevention.
Yes. And it's also, I think specifically with suicide loss, I just went to a training and Dr. Mark talked about this. He's, I'm going to mess up his title, but Dr. Mark is an expert in this field. He's a thanatologist and he works with trauma and grief. And one of the things that he talked about at this training that really struck out to me was like the ways that we talk about our grief when it's suicide versus when it's not, right? So the people who surround you, right? Everyone, when their loved one is lost, regardless of how their loved one is lost, wants you to tell them stories about their loved one, right? They want to hear the inside jokes that you had with their loved one that maybe they didn't know about, or they want to reminisce about those memories. And when someone dies by cancer, or if they get hit by a car, or any of these, whether it's traumatic or not traumatic way that we lost someone, we talk about them. When it's a suicide, often we talk about the suicide and what the method was, or what they did, or what was wrong with them, or why could they ever do that, and all of these other things. And we're not talking about the person. Yeah. And so that really stuck out to me on how starkly different that can be in our society. And again, another thing that can be really isolating for people is that
the isolation.
they don't feel like they can talk, or the only thing that people, again, I'm not blaming people. People don't know what to say, and they're going to ask those questions of, well, how did it happen? Or those types of things, and maybe not realizing that they're insensitive. They're really uncomfortable. They're trying to do something productive, but ultimately what people who have lost someone want to hear is who was my loved one to you, and what are these stories that you had. And so I think that's just a really profound thing for people to remember, is regardless of how they were lost, let's not focus on that. Let's focus on the person that they were.
Absolutely. Well, because everyone has a legacy to leave behind, and everyone has a story, and it's we can't allow ourselves to forget that just because we're grieving, or just because it is a hard thing to grieve when someone dies by suicide. We can't allow ourselves to forget that. And I think that that's something that I've thought about a lot, and hearing you just emphasize that just, hit close to home for me, because I left my last job for that exact reason. I was told that I couldn't talk about the suicide that happened. And I was told that I couldn't talk about it, and I couldn't share my perspective as the person who responded to that suicide. Well, it's equally my story as it is theirs at this point, because I was brought into the situation. I performed first aid. I was there when it happened, So how can you tell me that I can't talk about this when I'm being asked by family and friends and other staff members what happened? I don't want to tell them what happened. I want to tell them that their son is gone, or that their friend is gone, and that I watched his life go out of his eyes. I want to share something positive. I don't want to focus on the tough part of that moment. I want to focus on what was good about him, what was happy, this was the conversation, whatever. My story,
what that person meant to you.
Yeah, my story it's irrelevant at this point for this podcast, but I think it's something that we have to talk about, because we don't know how to talk about grief. So we have to talk about, well, stop talking only about how they died. Let's talk about them. There's this element of humanity that's lost, sadly, when someone dies by suicide. And I think that's the conversation, or the piece, that's the point that I'm trying to make here. Yeah. Okay, well, enough of my rambling on about my stories here. We've talked through postvention. We've talked through Survivors Joining for Hope. We've talked a little bit about the CDC strategies. I want to know a little bit more about the crisis response piece of things, and planning for safety and follow-up after a suicide, because that, I think, is really kind of where we're at. You talked about, you're following up with families 3 weeks, a month, a year later. We're building this infrastructure to keep people safe and to build community through loss. How does Survivors Joining for Hope do all of that specifically? I know it's a new program, but I want to know, what have you done currently, and then where in the future of postvention programming at Lost and Found do you see that going, and what supports and services do you think that we'll be offering eventually?
Yeah. So when it comes to crisis response, ultimately, we are not doing any of the crisis response, but we are partnering with the people that do. So one of our closest partners, and where we've actually gotten a lot of referrals, is from Front Porch Coalition, that is out in Rapid City. And they have something that's called a Lost Team. So a Lost Team is local outreach for survivors of suicide, I believe, if I'm getting that acronym right. And right. It is people who have a connection with the sheriff's department or the police department. And so when that call is made, and whether a family is there or whoever found someone, when the sheriff's department arrives on the scene, then these other people are called, and they are coming in to kind of offer some of that crisis support to people. So ultimately, I'm not the person that gets that call. I'm not the one that's showing up on people's doorsteps when they're just finding out about something like this. So that's the type of people that are. It's going to be emergency services. It's going to be volunteer groups and organizations like Lost teams that are coming in. And that's why a lot of times we get referrals from those types of groups, because those are the ones that are sitting with them and trying to figure out, how are we going to handle cleanup? Where are we going to stay? Who are we contacting for the funeral? All of these intense decisions that you have to make at a very heightened emotional time in a very short period of time. And so they're really critical at that point. So with that, right, I said those are the people that call us, and we are the ones that are ultimately not doing the crisis response, but we are coming in and helping with the financial assistance. And then as people are ready and maybe coming in and out of that fog, we are helping them kind of down the line with our resource support, therapy, talking to someone, other things like that. And even things like, if they need a different place to stay, that's something that I can help them with. I've worked in this field. I've worked a lot with low to income people in poverty, situations. I've worked at feeding missions, at homeless shelters. And so things like that are things that I know how to do. Do you need food? I know where to help you get it. Do you need a place that's different to stay? I can help you with that. And so some of those very practical stuff that people wouldn't necessarily think about. Are you going to be taking time off of work? Can you go back to work? Depending on what your job is, you might not be able to take that leave, right? Are you going to end up finding a new job? All of these different things are kind of in that piece that is afterwards. So that's the crisis response piece. I feel like that was the first part of your question. What was the second part of your question?
The second part of the question was, how are we providing this support, or how do you envision that we will be providing this support long term once the rest of our postvention programs are kind of more established?
Built out. Yeah. So I would love to continue to see the Survivors Joining for Hope program continue to grow. Obviously, when there's more awareness, we're probably going to end up getting more phone calls and helping more families, which ultimately we don't want that loss to be occurring. But if that loss is occurring, which we know by the numbers that it is, we want people to be reaching out to us for support. And I hope that we can continue to kind of network within these communities. Even just this last week when I was at a training, I found out about a support group that's being held in another really small town, right? These things that you can't really find out about. But these people, I'd hope that as the years go by, the people who have been through our program and maybe they get back up on their feet, that this can be a very holistic program that extends beyond just me, right? Because like I've said before, I'm not a loss survivor myself. And what I know is that I have the skills to help these people, but ultimately, in some ways, I don't see myself as a peer. And I think for me, that requires me in this program to do a really good job of helping all of them get connected to each other. Right. And so I hope to continue to see that kind of grow within the program and the ways that we can get people connected, whether through our programs or other programs, and would love to see some more peer support kind of happening as we help more families and as people are open to that. So that's more of like the Survivors Joining for Hope program and how I see kind of that expanding and growing. As far as postvention, we're really trying to expand into the campus space, and we want to provide kind of consultation and education to campuses. So like I spoke about, there's a campus that we've been working with out in Rapid City, and working really closely with them on how they can create a suicide response plan within their school and their administration. And so what does that look like, right? Because this is going to be a chaotic time for everyone. Yeah. And ultimately, we think about the students, right? The administrators, their clients are the students.
Absolutely.
But when a student dies by suicide, they are also affected. And so having something that is like a clear, concise plan, right? Things are always going to be messy, but as much as we can, a clear and concise plan of you do this and I do this and we do this so that we can inform people. We can stop rumors from spreading. We can provide all the people the support as quickly as possible is what we want, because what we know is that a little bit of support sooner is ultimately going to be better than a lot of support later. That's everything that postvention research would tell us. And so this response and having it ahead of time, really, which is a topic that no one wants to talk about, right? No one wants to say, oh, let's make a suicide response plan, because we hope that that never happens. But I also remember putting my geometry book over my head in high school for tornado drills, right? Like you have to do it. You have to have some sort of plan. And there was never a tornado while I went to school, but I knew exactly what to do, right? And so schools need this for to treat it. It is the tornado. It is the fire. The kids need to know. I shouldn't call them that. Students. Sorry, students. You're not kids. I'm still a kid. But the students need to know what to do. The administration needs to know what to do. And they need to know where to find support.
Yeah.
So I hope that we can really clarify that, and then really be able to provide to all the schools in our region some really good policy and procedure that is simple and clean, and they know what to do. And then on top of that, offering them more education so that they feel ready. And ultimately, I know this is a topic that no one really wants to talk about. And unfortunately, it becomes the topic that we talk about after something happens. And I hope that we can eventually at some point get away from that, right? And talk about it before that, so that we're more prepared. But we have to also use those opportunities to get in and make sure that people are prepared for the next time, or that they can heal. And so as far as postvention, I hope that we do a lot in the campus space, and then that we can kind of convert some of that easily into like a workplace environment, an organizational environment, so that we can just provide more educational opportunities and more of that like policy and procedure planning to anyone who is willing to put it in their handbook, I guess.
Well, I wish my organization had any sort of plan or response protocol in place when I was living that, because it was utter chaos. And of course it's going to be, but it is exacerbated when there's no policy or protocol. So I think that's really important work. I think it's really cool that we are the ones that are kind of facilitating that. I think that's a really unique place to be. And I think it's innovative and beneficial. And for us to kind of be the foremost thought leader, if you will, in that space, I think it's just really cool. So proud to have you be doing that. Kind of rounding us out here as we're approaching the end of our time together, what are some challenges that you have faced, or we have faced, or families have faced, as this is all, it's pretty new to us. You've only been in the role for 8 months. This program is new for Lost and Found. So explain some of the challenges that you personally have faced in this role, that you've seen families face, and that we as an organization have faced.
Yeah. So funding is probably the number one issue, right? We were given a pool of money. That money, I'll be honest, is getting thin since we've helped a lot of these families, and we need to replenish those funds. So we're going to need to figure that out. And I have hope that we will, but funding is always going to be a challenge when you're running a program that's giving money away. So that, and then also I would say that that's a challenge for the families too, right? Like that, I can't imagine being in that position. When I lost my own dad, I didn't lose my dad by suicide, but planning that funeral, and we didn't have, it was similar. We didn't have the funds readily available. We didn't have a plan for this. He didn't have any insurance, life insurance. And so you're trying to figure out what you're going to do, but also figure out a way that you can afford it. And that is challenging because you love this person and you want to give them the best service that you possibly can. And I can't imagine, because I've been kind of there, but that is the challenge that our families are facing, is what do I do versus the money that I have, and do I need to put it on a credit card, and are they looking ahead to know what that credit card interest rate is going to do ultimately because of this funeral, but you can't look any farther than your feet in situations like this. So I would say that that's a challenge for not only the program but the people that we serve, and ultimately for me, right? I'm the person who gets to call people and say, yes, we can help you, or no, we can't. So my hope is that we will always have enough money in the bank where I can say yes, and that the people that come to us fit our criteria, because saying no is heartbreaking, right? This is very emotional work. I will not say that it's easy to take those phone calls. The stories that I've heard, the mothers that I have cried with losing their loved ones, it's difficult. It is extremely difficult phone calls to take. But I want to be there for them because I have experienced loss myself. lots of different types of loss, and I know what grief feels like, and I know that it's isolating, and I know that it sucks and that you don't know what to do. And there have been families with experiences very close to mine, people who have been daughters who have laid their fathers to rest, who are responsible for planning things, and I'm there. Sometimes it brings me back, and it can be a way for me to move through my own grief and healing, to feel like I have the capacity to help someone else. But it's still hard. It is still really hard stuff to do. And my coworkers, you included, are whenever that I've received phone calls, or that we have lots of applications, are always like, "Are you good? Are you okay?"
Yeah.
Because everybody knows that I'm taking some really hard phone calls, and that it's really hard emotional work to be with people in that way. But it's good to be the person that walks alongside them as well. So I would say those are definitely some challenges. It's a new program, at least new to us. And I think there was lots of things that Brad and his team learned through the program when they had the program, and then it got handed over to us.
Yeah.
And we've tried to take some of those lessons and learn from them and adapt the program, but it's new and we're kind of figuring it out. And I'll be honest, we've helped these 13 families, and probably each and every one of them has had a different form of the process, right?
Sure,
I don't have a standardized way of doing the program yet that's been the same for every single person going
and
through
also
it.
You can't do something like this work and have it be standardized, because it removes the humanity of it too.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I have some templates of like things that you need to remember to ask to get the facts and the information, and templates for emails to make sure that you don't miss anything. Because some of it too is when I go into that emotional space with them, then I'm getting some of their fog as well. And I want to make sure that I'm not missing anything, because I'm the administrator of the program, right? I can't miss it. And so we have these like ways, and that's what I've been creating, is how can I make sure that whether it's me or it's someone else running this program, that you can be there in your fullest capacity emotionally with people, but then also make sure that all the T's get crossed and the I's get dotted. And so there's that piece of it too, just building out a new program and making sure, something that's really important to me is there's lots of organizations doing all this work. We can't all do it alone, but making sure that we're not duplicating each other's efforts, that we're not stepping on other people's toes, and that we are creating something that is ultimately for the people that we're serving, not something that we think that they need. So all of that, I would say, it comes with some challenges.
Well, yes, I can't imagine any program that is as critical and as heart-wrenching as ours doesn't come with challenges.
Yeah.
Everything comes with its challenges, but especially a new program and one of this capacity, one of this volume. We're seeing a major increase in suicides in our state, and or not a major increase, but like over time, a major increase. Yep. And it's not plateauing yet. So until we have a stabilizing factor, we're going to face challenges. Yeah. So I thank you for your work in that space. I'm very proud to be part of it, as a suicide loss survivor myself, and as someone who has lived through grief. I disagree with your earlier comment when you said that you don't consider yourself to be a peer, and that's why it puts you in a funky position sometimes. But just as well as any of us what grief is and what it feels like, and what your needs, wants, desires, feelings, etc. are when you're in that space. And so that's, in my opinion, what makes you the best person for this work, for this job, for this role. So,
well, thank you.
Keep doing you. Damn proud to be sitting next to you.
Thank you. Oh, desk buddy love.
So I had to lighten the space, lighten the mood a little bit here, but kind of wrapping us up here. We've got about 2 more questions left. So I want to think through, if we had a magic wand and all of the resources at our exposure, nothing was off the table, nothing was off limits, what would you do to provide the best support, resources, infrastructure, ecosystem, all of the words that you can possibly think of right now, for